back, everyone. Hello again. I hope you had a nice break. So we begin yesterday with questioning the idea of the people in global Europe and try to discuss social contract and AI and other aspects. And we are trying to proceed slowly to the solutions, even though every panel also have brilliant insights on the solutions. So this is one of the panels that will transition us more into that area. And I am very grateful for our panelists and the chair for discussing the people in search of democracy. And the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Simeye, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot to the organizers and to everybody who came. It's a privilege to chair this panel. I'm Max Steuer from the Department of Political Science at the Communist University in Bratislava and the Ginda Global Law School. And indeed, this theme of the people in search of democracy also evokes in me the possibility and openings of the options to decouple the notions of the people and democracy, right? So can we have democracy without the people? All these discussions about going beyond the human in the studies of democracy towards the non-human, towards the emphasis on the planet, or can we have also a democracy in a sense, or can we have the people who are trying to struggle against authoritarian upheavals? And I think we will hear about those as well in some of today's presentations. We have three excellent speakers and papers who are going through discussions on social movements in political theory, but also we have quite some emphasis in law in today's panel. So let me just briefly introduce them, and I would like to encourage everybody to look into their profiles and their work, including the papers for this conference. So on my right to your left is Rashad Seedeen, who is an adjunct research fellow in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Media at La Trobe University in Melbourne, but who is also a teacher in high school. And I think I want to particularly appreciate that dual role, which I think is extremely valuable for academia. And he traveled to us from Australia, so really thank you so much. And he will talk about the question of deepening democracy through civil society engagement and bring up these two thinkers of Gramsci and Wright. Then we will continue with Jana Ruwayha, who is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Law and a teaching and research assistant at the Global Studies Institute, both at the University of Geneva. And she will bring also this legal element through discussing the notion of emergencies and crises, but not only in that maybe negative or sense of problems, issues, but also in terms of how crisis governance may reshape the democratic future of the people. So I think this is a very interesting and valuable angle that we will hear about. And last but not least, we will have Dr. Özge Derman, who has a lot of achievements in various disciplines, not only in sociology, but also in arts, in dance. And currently she works at Sciences Po and Sorbonne University, and she will bring this element of social movements and struggles against perhaps authoritarian tendencies in various levels through discussing the performative power of the we in Occupy Wall Street and Gezi Movement. So without further ado, we will go in the order of the program. I asked the presenters to try to stick to 15 minutes with their presentations so that then we have some time for discussion. And I look forward very much to both those parts of the panel. So please, Rashad, the floor is yours.
So I'd first like to thank Maya and ECPS for actually inviting me along to this. This is the first time I've ever actually attended a conference and first time even presented at one. So I feel really lucky to actually be amongst so many people who provide such intellectually rigorous 2 days. And I found this to be a fantastic opportunity. I'd also, just really quickly, just other person to know, my wife and kids are watching tonight, and my kids are well past their bedtime, but I just want to say hello to them. Okay, so I better begin. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that all research and writing was completed on the lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. This research is based on the profound respect that I hold for Indigenous cultures and the necessity to listen, learn, and walk together for a better future. See, I've never used one of these before. There we go. As we've discussed over the past 2 days, democracy is under threat, and especially from far-right social forces. Marginalized communities are particularly vulnerable to attacks from the far right. Democratic initiatives that theoretically and practically empower communities are critical. Two theorists that provide important analytical insights and strategies in deepening and defending democracy are Erik Olin Wright with his Real Utopias project and Antonio Gramsci's concept of war position. So let's look at Wright first. The Real Utopias project is a research program that examines existing and theoretical democratic designs to reimagine social institutions. Wright was the scholar most closely associated with the Real Utopias project, but a number of other academics have continued this work. For Wright, a real utopia is a socially empowering and has the capacity to displace capitalism in favor of deepening democracy. A real utopia is practical and immediately workable, yet would also feature an egalitarian future. Therefore, it can not simply be a reform to address a specific problem. For example, many features of a welfare system would not be considered a real utopia, but a universal basic income would. According to Wright, real utopia designs can exist and even thrive in capitalist systems, as capitalism, like all other systems, is never absolute. So if we actually look at Wright's understandings of real utopias, you can actually break it down into 6 principles. 3 more principles that are equality, democracy, and sustainability, and 3 functional principles of desirability, viability, and achievability. Now, these 6 principles we'll look at later on when I actually have an existing example. Now, when we actually consider Erik Olin Wright, he actually does provide an insightful lens in which to critically interpret real utopia designs. But his fundamental problem is that he lacked the historical political context to his work. In particular, he did not really consider how antagonistic social forces could dismantle a real utopia. Now, I'm just going to go a bit quicker because I'm worried I'm going to run out of time. When we actually consider this, then my man, Antonio Gramsci, really provides some important insights. Unlike Wright, Antonio Gramsci his analysis is steeped in historicism. Gramsci's theoretical concepts was consistently contextualized by history and politics to give it greater meaning. Robert Cox provides a succinct description of Gramsci's analysis in saying that a concept in Gramsci's thought is loose and elastic and attains precision only when brought into contact with a particular situation which it helps explain, a context which also develops the meaning of the concept. And so therefore then, when you actually consider Gramsci's analysis, he's always applying theory to history, and then from that, you actually get a better understanding of it. And Gramsci uses a number of different heuristic devices in order to actually understand history. But the one that I'm going to look at in particular is the war position. Gramsci argues that a metaphorical trench warfare or war position is not only tactically necessary in a liberal democratic society, but an essential prerequisite in any socialist revolution. War position involves winning battles over the ideological terrain of a society and a capitalist society. In a society. In a capitalist society, this would be through exposing the inherent contradictions and tensions within a hegemonic bloc. In other circumstances, it could be presenting an alternative that is just and emancipating for all. An authentic and effective war position that moves towards an ideal ethical hegemony would be pluralistic and democratic in what Gramsci describes as an intellectual moral bloc. This type of war position invites active participation from a broad spectrum where there exists a mutually educative role for the masses and intellectuals. Gramsci wanted to steer away from a top-down form of leadership and rather wanted the masses to be empowered to contribute as equals in this debate and discussion. So if we then combine this and consider it as an analytical model, we can actually propose one that would be able to critically analyze the potential of these real utopia designs. And so in considering it, to ascertain if a social innovation is a real utopia alternative to capitalism, we should apply Wright's 3 moral principles of equality, democracy, and sustainability. To ascertain whether a real utopia has practical longevity, we should consider Wright's 3 functional principles of desirability, viability, and achievability. But for a real utopia to be robust and sustainable in a capitalist society, ideally shifting towards a more progressive socialist compass, Gramsci's theory based on the war position is necessary. So let's now actually apply this to an existing example. The First People's Assembly of Victoria. So the Victorian First People's Assembly was created as a representative body in treaty negotiations with the Victorian government of Australia. This is the first in our country and is considered quite revolutionary, I guess, in many ways. Now, the Assembly can be considered a form of an associative democracy in that it is designed to address the issues of a set group of people, in this case, Indigenous Victorians, and functions to enhance democracy by participating in the implementation of laws. Structurally, the Assembly has 33 members, made up of 21 elected representatives from the regions of Victoria and 12 representatives from traditional owner groups. Now, traditional owner group is a local Indigenous group that has an unbroken connection to the land and is recognized by the government as a traditional owner group. Now, for the whole entire Assembly itself, only traditional owner people can actually be members of this Assembly. And this is an important bit that I'll get to come back to later on. The First People's Assembly engaged with Indigenous civil society through a number of different deliberation practices to empower them in the process of treaty making. Such practices included yarning circles, cultural gatherings where Indigenous people had opportunities to share their thoughts and ideas to shape early policy for the First People's Assembly. The Assembly first established a separate and independent Aboriginal electoral role to increase access and participation. But this role itself was completely separate from the government and was protected. So therefore, the Indigenous people actually had data sovereignty over their identity, I guess you could say. Now, also they established an elder's voice institutionally, and that because the elders are considered so central to Indigenous culture, the elders themselves get to actually decide institutionally how to actually would function and form. They also had a youth voice because the actual majority of Indigenous people in Victoria are actually young people. So they needed to have their input in how this actually works. And even voting rights begins at 16. And so you actually have two young people who are actually providing representations or recommendations to the Assembly based on their youth perspectives. Now, probably the most significant project that has come from the Victorian First People's Assembly is the Europe Justice Commission, which essentially is a truth-telling commission. Truth-telling is a decolonizational process of reckoning with historical traumas caused by colonialism and neocolonialism. Such undertaking empowers victims and is directed towards a restorative outcome based on the Commission's recommendations. The word Europe comes from the Wamba language that means truth. Now, when Europe actually carried out, what they were able to do was get contributions from over 9,000 Indigenous Victorians, held over 400 events, 67 public hearing days, and collected 10,000 documents. In their first report, they actually had 40 recommendations. Just last week, they released 2 more reports where they provide a full history of Indigenous experiences from colonization to now. And they also have another report that has over 100 recommendations as well. So when they actually carried out these public hearings, or what they would call the Roaring Turang, it did not follow Western conventions. And testimonies were actually carried out in an Indigenous way. So they centered Indigenous practices. So for instance, you can actually do testimony on country, which means on their traditional grounds. They could do it in a group setting. They could do it through a cultural ceremony or through a cultural performance. Now, when it actually comes to the Europe Justice Commission and how they actually worked, the government was really open to their recommendations. So for instance, the government was willing to relinquish some of its power in regards to child protection services for Indigenous people, which is a really big issue for Indigenous people. And they were willing to negotiate so that Indigenous people actually had self-determination over child protection services, and they're in the process right now of negotiating it. So if we actually apply the Erik Olin Wright's analytical model, we can actually see that the First People's Assembly is fulfilling a number of these principles. So in regards to equality, it is quite inclusive and is involving elders, involving young people. They do all these deliberation practices, but there actually are a number of people who are Aboriginal or Indigenous who live in Victoria, but are not from the traditional owner groups. Therefore, then they're actually disenfranchised from being able to be representatives of this party. So I actually personally talked to an elder from Victoria, and he is actually quite angry and annoyed that he can't be a part of it. And he's actually protested against it and wrote letters on it because he feels like the actual body isn't as democratic as he would like it to be. When it comes to democracy, the grassroots deliberation has been quite fundamental, and they've really been able to get active involvement from the local indigenous community in a number of different ways. But as it gets bigger, it's becoming more bureaucratic, and that transparency isn't as valuable to them as it previously was. And so there is some concerns that it's not going to be as transparent as it goes forward. It becomes more bigger. Sustainability, support from the Labour government is ongoing, and the Labour government actually has quite a strong majority, and the opposition party, the Conservative opposition party, is quite weak, and it doesn't look like they're going to win an election anytime soon. So that means that this process, the treaty-making process, should last for a fair bit of time. Now, the York Justice Commission has fundamentally justified why they actually need to have this treaty-making process, and so therefore then that desirability is definitely there. Now, the viability of this program will definitely be seen out from the work that the Justice Commission and the First People's Assembly actually does. Now, in regards to achievability, the government has already been quite responsive in a number of their different recommendations, and we'll see how that plays out. There is still a fair bit of fight over a number of different things, but right now the government seems to be quite open to it. Okay, so let's now consider Gramsci's understanding of war position, how this could actually be applied through looking at past historical examples. So what I'm going to look at is one negative example and one positive example. Okay, so the negative example, the one that's actually was concerning, is a 2023 failed voice to parliament referendum. And then the positive one that actually gives us a little bit of hope is the response to the treaty's principle bill that actually tried to undermine the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand. So the first, the voice of parliament was a proposed change to the constitution. It was part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart that advocated for treaty, truth-telling, and the voice of parliament. In 2022, the new elected Labour government decided to focus on introducing a voice of parliament first through a referendum. The voice of parliament would be would be non-binding and not have veto powers and can only make representations to the government. So essentially, it was a body to provide recommendations to the government, but they couldn't really do anything. There was no actual real power to it at all. And so in order to actually do it, they actually needed to have a referendum to change the constitution. And so they proposed this question, okay, to the actual people. And the question was, a proposed law to alter the constitution to recognize the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? 2 campaigns were launched, one that supported the proposal, the yes side, and those that were against it, the no side. The no side was actually quite effective at doing a misinformation campaign, while the yes side really struggled to build an organic intellectual block that was effective in debunking what was actually happening from the no side. So if we actually consider the no side, it was led by the Conservative Labour Party, who formulated a rather effective strategy of misinformation and fear-mongering over the potential consequences of the voice. On top of that, social media was amplified quite significantly, and so it was like 4 times more than the yes campaign. So essentially, the provocative and conspiracy-laden nature of the no's campaign messaging was just essentially just loved by the algorithms, and they really ate it all up. And so we actually look at some of these examples, we'll see how devoid from reality it actually was, but also how you could see it actually generating, I guess, popularity amongst the people, either from a way in which they thought was supportive, or whether they actually just hate watched it. Okay, so let's look at some of the examples. The voice would have the power to seize private homes. The voice was a new form of apartheid. The voice would have the power to overrule the parliament. And my personal favorite, the voice would pave the way for the UN to invade Australia. And this was legitimate. Like, it got so much popularity in the general public that the Prime Minister himself had to address it and say, this referendum is not going to allow the UN to invade us at all. Do not be concerned with that. And so this is how big some of these conspiracy theories actually got. All right, so in regards to Yes campaign, they really struggled to actually build momentum and build engagement with society. So they actually had too many people having contradictory sort of notions. They didn't have a clear form of leadership. And even though the Prime Minister was the one that launched this referendum, he really took a step back once he actually saw that the referendum was going to struggle and he wasn't going to win. And so he started focusing on other things, and he started to distance himself from the referendum itself. And so it became a real problem for them. Now, the other side of it was that the Greens, the left-wing sort of party of the parliament, was split, where a number of people within the party, especially Indigenous members of the Greens, actually opposed the voice as well, because they actually saw it as a wrong way in which to carry out change. And they had essentially a progressive no vote from the Black sovereign movement. And they thought the voice was a very weak legislation that would undermine the actual progress of the Indigenous movement. And so because of this contradictory sort of yes campaign and the struggles of actually having a clear messaging, it really failed. And so even though they had 60% support before the campaign was launched, it completely flipped. And by the end of it, 60% of our population voted no against it, and 30% only voted in favor of it. So let's now look at a more positive example, which is a New Zealand experience. Now, Maori in Australia and Indigenous Australia are quite different experiences, different worlds as well. So in Maori culture in New Zealand, it's central in New Zealand. In Australia, it's on the periphery. New Zealanders really celebrate Maori culture, and they have it clearly a part of their identity. While in Australia, they're really struggling to understand how they actually incorporate Indigenous culture, Indigenous ideas in our society. And so this is like an ongoing problem with Indigenous people in Australia. And even though not everything's perfect in New Zealand, obviously they have far more power and influence and centrality in New Zealand society. So let's just take that in consideration when we actually discuss this. So in 1840, the Crown actually established a treaty between the Maori people and the English government, I guess you could say, the Commonwealth. And from that, they actually had two different versions. So they had an English version and a Maori version. And in the English version, they actually says that they've given sovereignty to the Crown, but in the Maori version, it does not say that at all. And so this says that they're providing governance to New Zealand, but sovereignty stays with the Maori people, and they get to have control over all the natural resources and its treasures. Okay, so then when it first came into power, obviously the Crown used the English version, not the Maori version. And so then as time went on and they lost more and more land and more rights, things actually changed, and the Maori movement became more and more powerful and was able to actually have the Maori version recognized over the English version. And 1975 is really when that kind of change took place, where they established the Waitangi Tribunal that addressed land claims. And so since that time, land rights has become a bigger issue, where more and more land has actually been given back to the Maori people, and same in regards to their control over natural resources. Okay, I'll only got 2 more slides if I think I should be right. All right, so in regards to that, then the Treaty of Waitangi actually is deeply integrated into New Zealand society based on a number of different statutory laws. So for instance, in local councils, there's Maori wards, where Maori people actually have guaranteed representation, and they actually have a lot of power over decision-making. They also have power over natural resources, such as mining licenses, water rights, things like that. Their language is deeply a part of Maori society. So if you actually go to New Zealand, a lot of people actually say hello in the Maori language, which is kia ora. And past New Zealand prime ministers have actually spoken in Maori first before they actually address crowds. And so students learn it as well. In regards to representation in the actual New Zealand Parliament, they get guaranteed seats as well. So they have 7 guaranteed seats where Maori people get to vote on Maori seats as well as the regular election. So recently, a minor party, the ACT Party, tried to introduce a treaty principles bill that would actually completely undermine the institutional power of the Treaty of Waitangi, based on this, narrow concept of equality. So a bit like the Voice of Parliament, where they talked about how this Voice of Parliament would be divisive and racist, and they try to adopt this kind of like really simplistic democratic language. This guy tried to do it as well. And so when he tried to introduce these treaty principles bill to completely undermine the Treaty of Waitangi, there was this immediate resistance. And my personal favorite one was when MP Hana Rafiti Mapi Clark tore up the bill and performed the haka. And I'm sure many of us have seen it online. Yeah, it was absolutely fantastic. And all these other people joined her on the floor. People in the gallery joined in as well. It was quite a fierce and creative resistance. The Labour leader himself also actually called the bill a grubby little bill on the parliamentary floor as well. So you had this, resistance from not only the Maori people, but also from the established parties. Now, this movement created essentially like a collective will, where people actually gathered together in a number of different ways in a creative and I guess like energized resistance. And so you had the King and the Maori people call all the iwis or the tribes of New Zealand to come together and organize a resistance, which actually formulated in a hikoi or a march that started all the way up at Auckland and went all the way down to the border of the North Island in Wellington to actually demonstrate how much they opposed this bill. So, sorry, it actually had about 10,000 people. And New Zealand's a very small population, so 10,000 is quite significant. It was multi-layered and quite creative as well. And so there was this like, you know, imagination and creativity about it and this fierceness where they absolutely opposed it. And so that Treaty Principles Bill got completely destroyed and was rejected. But the government has 28 other reform bills that are looking to undermine the Treaty Waitangi. So well, I'll just finish up there. So this war position will have to keep on going. All right, this is my last slide. I'm promising to finish. All right. So in regards to this, then we have a number of different lessons. So very quickly, the generally supported public can actually be adversely influenced by coordinated repetitive blitz of misinformation from key figures. And that powerful conservative forces are prepared and ready to oppose radical reforms if they see it undermining or challenging their privileged positions. Therefore, then we need a broad alliance in what Gramsci would call these deputies who would spontaneously respond, just like they did in New Zealand, to resist any of these changes. And so then the Treaty Waitangi sort of demonstrates what we can actually structurally accomplish when we actually have, you know, democratic reforms. And so I just want to finish with this last note. Real Utopia designs of the First People's Assembly and the Treaty Waitangi demonstrate that treaty is not an endpoint, but rather an ongoing process of deepening social empowerment and hence democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashad. Congratulations on the first conference presentation. And yet move on without further ado to Jana.
Okay. So, hello everyone. I would like to, before starting, just thank the organizers again for the this amazing conference and all the attention to detail that you've put. It's really appreciated. So today I'll be shedding the light on how normalization of emergency measures and emergency powers in liberal democracies reshapes the relationship between the state and the people, challenging foundational democratic principles and calling into question who truly governs in time of prolonged crisis. To summarize, I will argue that this shift blurs the line between normal governance and emergency, risking democratic erosion. But also I stumbled upon this quote that says that in Chinese, the word crisis has dual meaning. It can represent danger, but also an opportunity. So a crisis can also be an opportunity to rethink governance by, within the theme of this conference, empowering citizens and building resilience against populist and authoritarian pressures. To begin with, I will start with a bold affirmation. I think that we should challenge the quote-unquote classical conception of the emergency paradigm because it has become somewhat outdated. So traditionally, as we know them, states of emergencies are supposed to be temporary, exceptional, and proportional responses to significant and determined threats, such as, for example, war or natural disasters. For example, we already had this in the Roman dictatorship, which had a system that granted extraordinary powers for a very limited duration of time, 6 months, to manage crisis. We also had, after World War II and many European countries, emergency powers that were further constrained with the idea of the rule of law safeguards to prevent authoritarian overreach. So we had this idea of temporal limitation, of proportionality, of necessity. Initially, and emergencies were seen as these short-term deviations from ordinary governance with a sort of clear-cut on-off mechanism, a bit like a light switch, with always the goal in mind of quote-unquote returning back to normalcy so the status quo ante post-crisis. But our contemporary crisis landscape really differs from this classical emergency paradigm because it features interconnected crises that are also overlapping and that have embedded gradually emergency logics into ordinary governance. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic initially began as a public health crisis, but very quickly also spiraled into economic turmoil, supply chain disruption, and political unrest. Similarly, the war in Ukraine is not just a political conflict, but a geopolitical conflict, but it has also disrupted global food and energy supplies, reshaped global alliances. So crises now operate more like a dimmer switch. This is an expression that I borrow from legal scholar Stéphanie Annette-Baucher, meaning that they operate now at varying intensities. So we're more or less in an emergency. There's also Dyson House that has this notion of legal gray holes. So right now we are in an emergency, but does it really feel like an emergency? So this open-ended emergency, we've even had certain states of emergencies that have persisted for decades. For example, Ireland's prolonged emergency from 1939 to 1995, Israel's continuous state of emergency since 1948, or Egypt that operated under emergency law for over half a century between 1958 and roughly 2011. To better understand the legal and democratic transformations triggered by these contemporary crises, I combine a legal approach with something called complex adaptive systems theory, which is more used in the sciences than in law usually. And with CAS theory, I examine legal systems not as static frameworks, but rather as evolving and interconnected networks. So unlike traditional models, CAS theory helps highlight how crises first are nonlinear. So small legal or policy shifts, like, for example, introducing mass surveillance tools can escalate gradually into major and lasting disruptions to checks and balances or democratic norms. It also helps identify trigger mechanisms, which refers to acute shocks such as terrorist attacks or pandemics, for example, or a global financial crisis like what we had in 2008, that can disrupt the system and catalyze sweeping emergency laws. Another feature or key concept from CAS theory is also we have emergent properties and feedback loops. Essentially, I can give an example. Public fear during prolonged crisis, for example, can build support for further restrictive policies that reinforce narratives that often put the people against perceived threats or enemies, which is, as we've discussed until now, a common populist framing. And by doing so, crisis can also generate what CAS theory calls bifurcation points. So a system that splits into two. And here, liberal democracies have a choice. They can either adapt to protect democratic principles or backslide into more liberal or authoritarian structures by normalizing exceptional powers, which is unfortunately what's currently happening. And this can lead to a hysteresis, which is basically a point of non-return back. So you cannot, once the point of hysteresis is reached, there is no returning back to normal, quote unquote. So this is what I'm trying to examine. So just to summarize a bit, the CAS theory approach can be very helpful to understand how these prolonged crises, like the war on terrorism or COVID, these open-ended emergencies can reshape democratic foundations and create a new legal equilibrium that risks sidelining the voice of the people. So, as I mentioned earlier, prolonged crisis blurred the line between emergency and normalcy gradually by embedding exceptional powers into ordinary law. So emergency powers that, as I said earlier, were initially designed for short-term use are sometimes retained way long after the immediate threat has passed. For example, in the post-9/11 war on terror in the US, the Patriot Act institutionalized very broad surveillance powers, many of which remained in force more than 2 decades later. And there's also the case of France's emergency regime after the 2015 Paris attacks, which was initially conceived to fight the terrorist threat, but was later used in different other circumstances, such as against climate activists or migrants. So this quote-unquote contamination of ordinary law weakens democratic principles like transparency and accountability. We've seen, for example, an expansion of, in different countries, executive authority, while the judicial and or legislative oversight diminishes, which created a concentration of power and reduced democratic control. And many presentations also mentioned this in different ways regarding the crisis rhetoric. The justifications for these emergency measures often rely on this crisis rhetoric, which fuels a populist narrative that exploits fear and deepens societal division. Terms like enemy, for example, threat, self-defense have been significantly broadened and blurred. For example, we talk about a war against terrorism or the metaphor of fighting an invisible or hidden enemy for COVID that justified prolonged lockdowns and travel restrictions, for example, many of which lingered again beyond the initial intended date. So as a result, we have democratic backsliding that can intensify and public accountability erodes, with the people increasingly being sidelined in political and legal processes. So we really, really need, in this era of perma crisis, safeguards to ensure that citizens remain active democratic agents in shaping, especially crisis governance, and not just passive subjects of indefinite exception. Under these expanded notions of national security, self-defense, the tension between public safety and individual rights has become increasingly acute. We are witnessing a very gradual but very scary shift from protecting democratic rights to putting a priority on security imperatives. And here we've seen the principle of proportionality, which is also being really stretched. We have restrictions that are introduced, as I mentioned earlier, during crisis that often outlast the peak of the threat, which gradually shrinks the space of civil liberties. Some examples include counter-terrorist laws, such as the one that I mentioned earlier, the US Patriot Act, or France's SILT law that have institutionalized to this day mass surveillance and data collection into ordinary governance, or more recently, public health laws to fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, such as France's 2020 law that extended exceptional measures like digital tracking, movement restrictions, and normalized them into ordinary governance. So with this, the result is that human rights are becoming more and more contingent and subordinated to the constantly evolving notion of security, creating very fertile ground for populist appeals that claim to defend the people against these external and or internal threats. So what do? Do we just sit back and watch the world burn? How can democratic systems be resilient and keep the people at the center of governance? So resilience, and here I'm also referring to a notion of resilience that comes from legal theories, but also CAS theory. Resilience does not necessarily mean a return to the pre-crisis normality, this famous status quo ante. But there are three potential pillars that can underpin resilient legal systems. First, robustness, meaning the capacity to resist disruptions and safeguard democratic norms. Second, adaptability, meaning the flexibility to reconfigure rules and institutions in response to evolving threats. And third, recovery potential, so the ability to regain functionality post-disruption without significant alteration to core societal functions. So a resilient legal system might stabilize at a new level of equilibrium, reconfiguring itself to maintain essential functions in a new and changed environment. So essentially, resilience does not necessarily mean resisting change altogether, but rather ensuring that these adaptations, especially these responses to crisis, do not permanently weaken democratic foundations and institutions. And crucially, within especially the team of this conference, resilient governance also means empowering the people through participatory mechanism, like many of my colleagues have already talked about, so that they don't lose their voice in shaping the rights and protections that define democratic life and allows to resist populist attempts to sideline or even instrumentalize them. To conclude, here are a few takeaways. First, I would say it's important to maybe reflect or rethink the classical emergency model, this idea of, or this illusion rather, of reversible exception, which has, in my opinion, shifted to a permanent emergency logic that has blurred normalcy and exception and has led to an increased risk of democratic backsliding. Then it's important to also know that we do have tools that can help democracies face this and come out even stronger post-crisis. But here, resilient crisis governance requires an adaptable, inclusive, and transparent responses that especially prioritize citizens' empowerment and democratic participation. And finally, I would say, also in line with this conference's interdisciplinary approach, in an interconnected world, to effectively address these transnational threats such as pandemics or climate change that go far beyond one single country's borders, it's really important to have collaborative and interdisciplinary approaches and ongoing constitutional dialogue to strengthen democratic legitimacy and counter populist challenges to the people and their rightful role in democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jana, also for sticking to the time. And it was very insightful reference to the capacity of bringing also some change and transformation as an outcome of the crisis, rather than just returning to some old dreams or imaginations of normalcy, which may sometimes also not be democratic necessarily. And now let's move on to Özge. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the organization and invitation. First of all, so today I will talk about creative and performative configurations of the we and how they emerged and contributed to the political space in post-2010 social movements. This paper draws on my previous research on creative performativity in Occupy Wall Street and Gezi Movement. Occupy Wall Street in New York, 2011, Gezi Movement in Istanbul, 2013. And it offers a transnational analysis of how the collective we becomes visually and discursively visible, embodied, and how it is articulated through performative forms of togetherness. Okay. Arendt writes in Human Condition, wherever people gather together, it is potentially there, but only potentially, not necessarily, and not forever. The power of people, she argues, arises when they act in concert in public space, and it lasts as long as they act and speak together. She points out the potential political power may disappear as promptly as it appears. Power has an ephemeral character, power of the people, depending upon the congregation and the dissipation of bodies in public space. Building on Arendt, Butler emphasizes that the bodies appear in public space to express dissent, to protest, to claim their right to existence. Their public space is thus generated by the actions, speech, and togetherness of the people. It is also a space of appearance of the we exercising their alliance, somehow temporarily, a political space that materializes through action and solidarity, creative enactments of togetherness, and performative staging of power. The question is to understand how performative activism, performative actions redefine and shape these spaces, even when confronted with other forms of togetherness that challenge or complicate them. I conducted a qualitative research inquiry combining semi-structured interviews with activists, participant observation, and both traditional and digital archival analysis for this research. In Occupy Wall Street and Gezi Movement, people occupied the parks and squares, Zuccotti Park in New York, Gezi Park and Taksim Square in Istanbul. Urban space was transformed through the continuous movement of the people and creative spatial arrangements. The togetherness appeared in potential and temporary compositions of collectivity. Arendt's human togetherness, human unity emerges when people are with others and neither for nor against them, incorporating the bodies into the space of appearance and contention. If taken as a linguistic manifestation of togetherness, for example, Gezi Movement's slogan, "Everywhere is Taksim, everywhere is resistance," incorporates the material space and the human togetherness, literally claiming a neighborhood which becomes the symbol of resistance and occupation of spaces everywhere. In Occupy Wall Street, we is boldly expressed in the slogan, "We are the 99%. The 99% not only represented the people who are buried in debt after the US real estate crisis in 2008, but also those positioned themselves against the 1% who owns the 40% of the wealth in the world. Through the slogans, creative practices, performances, chants, assembled bodies in action, in Occupy Wall Street and Gezi, people gave meaning to their presence both individually and collectively. So here on the right, you can see Occupy Wall Street poster. Actually, that was created before the occupation, created by Ed Buster's journal, anti-capitalist journal, Canadian. And they asked people to occupy Wall Street, basically. The people rendered visible their dissent while articulating a collective subjectivity, not drawing on a homogenic entity, but rather potential compositions of collectivity, a collective subjectivity that came into existence by its actions, as Deasing argues. On the one hand, we refers to the sharing of words and deeds and acting together, which is essential to form a collectivity embodying a performative power. On the other, we is embodied through potential combinations of singularities who stood independently and who did not necessarily share the same words or deeds or acts. In this sense, the collective subjectivity appears in the shape of creative enactments of togetherness, creating temporary choreographies of protest subject to disappearance as well. Now, let me articulate more on how creative enactments of togetherness emerged in both movements. By setting up, this is Occupy Wall Street, as you can see, by setting up a camp in the middle of financial district, Occupy protesters targeted to denounce the deep-rooted relationship of the political and economic elite, power elite. The occupied Zuccotti Park was the place for daily organized general assemblies. General Assemblies of the New York City. The assemblies in Zuccotti Park embodied the experience of direct democracy through the practice of the consensus method for collective decision-making without hierarchy or leadership. Bodily presence preceded deliberation. Of course, it was through the act of showing up, assembling, and expressing their consensus and dissensus that collective subjectivity began to take shape. The assemblies enacted a radical politics of inclusion with the practice of progressive stack that allowed people to voice their grievances. Traditionally marginalized communities such as women or men of color could take the lead in order to move beyond the universalist interpretation of the 99%. In response to the city's ban on amplified sound, so they couldn't use microphones or megaphones, protesters developed creative strategies such as the people's mic and hand signals to facilitate the communication and deliberation in the park. On the right side, you can see the hand gestures, and on the left side, you can see a screenshot from a YouTube video in the park. The human microphone was invented during Seattle anti-capitalization, anti-globalization protests in 1999, but it was reused during the Occupy Wall Street. The human microphone required intentional pauses and repetitions for the assembled bodies participating to the assembly, creating a rhythm of togetherness, a lived experience of solidarity. It fostered a more horizontal and participatory way of communication through the active listening and repeating, and disrupted the notion of charismatic leadership. Basically, during the human microphone practice, I would speak without microphone, and the first or the second line would repeat what I said, and then the other line and the other line. And my words were also disrupted at the end, probably. And yesterday, Luke mentioned Occupy's leaderful organization, for example, during his presentation. And it was, yes, it was called leaderful. So the leaderfulness was really important, but also leaderlessness was important. So the different scholars argued differently. And also today, this morning, Naomi's presentation about listening. Here, we can really have this listening because we have to listen what the speaker tells to be able to repeat and then listen again and to repeat and listen again to repeat. And the practice of hand gestures is also about listening because you have to react through the hand gestures after listening the speaker. The practice of hand gestures occurred also to engage in, react to, interfere with the speaker's discourse as tools of verbal communication. For example, if there's a strong objection or a block in this discussion, you would do an X sign with your hands to say, without words, that I'm objecting what you're saying, basically. When performed collectively, of course, it visually signaled consensus without it interrupting the speaker. Hand signals created a shared embodied vocabulary that enabled horizontal and inclusive deliberation during the assemblies. Important to mention also apparent consensus concept developed by Urfolino, highlighting the ambiguity of silence in collective decision-making. Those who do not express their opinions may appear to consent, yet in reality, they might simply be deferring to the decision to the others by choosing not to oppose it. However, the hand signals served as a nonverbal embodied tools of expression, allowing those unable or unwilling to speak actively to contribute to the deliberative process. And also one challenge during the General Assemblies, there were called interrupters by the participants of the movement. There were people who disrupted continuously the process of deliberation, somehow by speaking loudly or saying negative things, or sometimes obstructing others from speaking and impeding inclusive participation. A second interrupting element, or act, we can say, during the assemblies was the drumming. The practice of drumming, the drummer groups in the park, they played drums continuously, 24/7, basically, and it was loud. So it made really difficult for people to deliberate, to speak, understand what the speaker says. So there was a big negotiation process between the drummers and the organization of the New York City General Assemblies. That they tried to limit the drumming 2 hours a day, but it didn't work out. Finally, they continued to do the drumming. And let's continue with the Gezi movement. So here, a single body, I want to start with the standing man, single body that of a performer, dancer, stood in the middle of Taksim Square on June 17, 2013. He remained silent and immobile for 8 hours to protest the violent policing during the Gezi movement. His act went viral and became TT on Twitter with the hashtag standing man in Turkish. Unplanned and unscheduled, his act resonated widely and became unexpectedly contagious. While some individuals physically joined him in Taksim Square, you can see in the first, and like after 5 hours, I think, the right, in the image on the right. Some people joined physically, some people joined on social media, and some people joined elsewhere. I personally joined as well, because he's my friend also. And I didn't know he would do that. It was a surprise to me as well. And it turned a single body's resistance to a collective performance of the we. And the police couldn't do anything because nobody was shouting, nobody was doing anything, let's say, disruptive. Single bodies appeared and disappeared spontaneously in various locations, often shorter in duration than the standing man, original standing man, yet the ongoing flow of such appearances constitute a dispersed and resilient we, difficult to trace and performatively powerful. There, the square, all alone, occupy all alone, but you muster the whole square. That is how the performer who triggered the act of standing still and silent articulates the capacity of a single body to claim public space and stage its performative power. His words stress how bodily presence may temporarily redefine and reshape the space, as well as the emergence of the we, the people. The performative manifestation of togetherness may equally serve as a source of inspiration for individuals and groups with opposing ideological positions. An illustrative example of the conflictual nature of democracy within the Gezi movement is precisely this figure as standing man, whose silent protest not only inspired acts of collective performance of we within the movement, but also provoked a counter-performance by the standing man against the standing man, how they called themselves. They basically created these T-shirts printed, and it's written "Standing Man Against the Standing Man," and they also performed the supporters of the government. Of course, they also performed the same act of standing still and silent. In the context of Occupy Wall Street, 99% appeared in graphical, discursive, vocal representations and actions such as Occupy Wall Street posters, Occupy comic publications, handmade signs, slogans, art exhibitions during and after the movement. And that signal you can see on the right, Occupy Wall Street bat signal projection on the Verizon building in New York by the group Illuminated. In digital spaces also, We Are the 99% was created, a blog created by two Occupy Wall Street activists, where people can share why they feel themselves as the part of 99%. The we of the Gezi movement took shape around the figure of Çapulcu, means looter. It became performative and unifying identity for those resisting authoritarian governance and police violence. Performed through slogans, chants, songs, banners, graffiti, Çapulcu became to embody a distinct political stance, which continues to represent a democratic aspiration. In today's protest events, for example, in Istanbul, Çapulcu identity used in slogans and posters and banners in the protest for after the arrest of the Istanbul mayor İmamoğlu in Turkey in the last month. In embodying the Çapulcu identity, the humor was at the core during the Gezi movement and resonated widely in a creative way, both in the streets and digital platforms. Unfortunately, I don't have time to share everything today. I can talk about this for a day. And I have so many images, but we don't have time, unfortunately. Even Chomsky, as you can see, he felt himself as a Çapulcu, and he shared this YouTube video saying that he is also a Çapulcu. So while the park also here interruptions or disruptions or some tensions in the park also happened in the park, tensions that exist in society already. They were also transferred in the park, but the organization and people, they could find a spatial arrangement. So groups with tensions, they were located in different parts of the park, so there were no tensions anymore. Practical solution. And to conclude, performative actions and togetherness enabled a democratic process, a political miracle. In White terms, it was before, I think, yeah. Micah White actually was one of the co-editors of the Edbuster magazine, who wrote a book about Occupy Wall Street as well. So he talks about a political miracle in Occupy Wall Street, but it could be the case for Gezi or other occupation movements. All the voices could be heard, all the grievances could be shared, and in this process, acting bodies challenge the conventional forms of representational politics, particularly advancing direct, creative, and performative forms. So people are with others, not against nor for others. This is not conflictual as Aaron terms, but also we can take it as conflictual. Conflictual disruptions also can interrupt the established order to be able to reframe, re-articulate, and reinvent new trajectories. Finally, the direct democratic processes enacted in public spaces during Occupy Wall Street and Gezi movement revealed a form of political activity grounded in consensus and dissensus and appeared through the performative power of the we. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Özge, and thank you to all of you for the fascinating presentations. Of course, each would deserve more than 90 minutes of discussion, but we don't have that. So I will defer my comments, except to say that I encourage also to work on developing your papers towards publication. And there the question might be whether it's actually book projects or article projects, because really the richness of the empirical data or the theoretical frameworks in some cases is maybe beyond what a single article can encompass. So that raises also the question of the scope. But I think we have an excellent ground here for discussion. So I will right away open the floor for any questions, and we can even do a collection of questions. So have a couple of questions. First, you may direct them to a specific speaker or to several speakers, and then we'll have a round of responses, and we see how many more rounds can we do within the time allotted. So yes, please. And I would still encourage maybe the introductions of those who ask the questions so that we know.
Hi, everyone. I was battling for the microphone in the last two sessions, so that's why I kind of raised my hand right away. In this panel, I'm going to ask a question. Yeah, so I'm very excited for it also. Fascinating papers. And I think I have a similar question to all three presenters, because that was the idea that I kept in mind throughout the whole panel. And that is the question about continuity. For instance, how do we keep ensuring the continuity of the war of position? Like what from a political theory perspective, for instance, is there some principles that we can learn from the experience in New Zealand and Australia, and can we not just apply, for instance, Gramsci and Wright, but like from the experiences we can contribute to the theory in terms of ensuring continuity? What are, like, how is it being done would be was in my mind all the time while listening to Rashad's presentation. And same goes with the like what I found very interesting about the second presentation was Jana's paper is the continuity in terms of ensuring international interdisciplinary cooperation and and kind of understanding it from the position of enforcement, because it's law, like it's one thing about legality, but like how about ensuring the enforcement? And the way that you talked about resilience from a legal perspective, from a political science perspective, is also a little bit, it was very interesting, because like in the usually political scientists differentiate between resistance and resilience, and how you talk about it is very is a little bit different, and I think captures some of the dynamics better. So I thought that was like, if it's going to be a paper, it can be something to highlight, because I think it's a contribution. And about the Gezi protest and the Occupy, like the whole performative power of the both Gezi and Occupy, but like, of course, as being Turkish, like my mind is always at the Turkish case more than that. It's undeniable. But personally, what struck me during the Gezi protest was, like when it was continuing, there was this potential and that whole transformative power, people from different spectrum of the ideological perspective coming together. But like when it ended, the hopelessness, and like it made me feel so much, like that feeling that came after it. So how do we continue with that transformative, performative effect once these waves, like Gezi or like what happened after Imamoglu's arrest, when they stagnate? How do we ensure the involvement? So I think my question of continuity for all speakers.
Thank you very much. Further questions? If not, at this point, maybe I would add one to Jana, also from the perspective of concepts, but maybe more the concept of agency, because of course I find this adaptive systems theory very interesting, but then who should do what, in a sense? You put emphasis on the role of citizens, but citizenship is also an exclusionary concept. Some would argue that actually it's a dominating concept because it has the dimension of othering, that, you know, if citizens are those who should be involved, who should maybe make more decisions in regard to emergencies, then non-citizens maybe don't have those options to make the decisions. So who should do what? And maybe also borrowing from Rashad, I think the emphasis on intellectuals, maybe sometimes also in a negative way, if they go against the indigenous rights, as in some cases it may have been in Australia. But what would be the role of the intellectuals, maybe of these kind of epistemic communities of elites, but specifically the intellectuals, because of course the partisan elites are also embroiled in the need to gain votes, and it's a different dynamic slightly than that of the intellectuals. So maybe that question of agency. Last chance for this round. If not, then let's take one more question, and then we'll do short responses from each panelist, and we'll try to do another round then.
Yeah, I just want to specify the question of continuity a little bit. Maybe pose this question to all three of you, right? So in political economy, we would always model the problems that you have talked about as collective action problems, right? These are just like enduring prisoners' dilemmas, such that nobody has an incentive to do anything, right? And the perennial question of political philosophy is, how can we have good law, even though producing good law presents a collective action problem that is best captured in a prisoner's dilemma, right? And I'm particularly interested whether the new cybernetic school called collective, how is it called, adaptive study system? Complex adaptive system. Complexity adaptive systems, whether they have like any kind of interesting novel ideas of how to solve this collective action problem, right? Because obviously when we come together, right, and then protest, you know, this is fun, this is performance, you know, we all get something from that. We get paid basically, right? In our individual happiness in, you know, participating. But then, you know, if it drags on, it's like 1 month, 2 months, we get less and less and less, right? And then the full power of the collective action problem wins again, and the problems get never solved, right? Exactly as Jana said, right? That there's like this erosion of the legal rules, right? We just, yeah, because of the collective action problem, it seems like these problems are very sticky. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot. So let's go in the reverse order. So start with Özge.
Okay, thank you for the questions. And I will start with the continuity question. What are the principles, what we learn from the experiences? I think in like social movements are made for also for repression. We act because there is some sort of repression. We get out because there is something restricting us. So it's a continuous movement. In that sense, we cannot have collective action being out all the time. It's impossible. So it's a sort of continuity in that sense. There's a continuity, it's a circle, it's a cycle. So it should, there are many scholars who worked on that kind of cycle in protests and social movements. There is a transformative power within the movement, but it is not only within the movement, because the transformative power stays in different forms. It's not visible all the time, but for example, I can give an example of as I just wrote a paper on young people taking the streets after İmamoğlu's arrest in Istanbul, for example. I made the research and I talked to many young people in Istanbul, from Istanbul and from Paris, who took the streets. And First of all, these young people, they did not know about Gezi in the sense that they were very young. They were 8, 10 years old when Gezi happened. But each one of them mentioned Gezi, first of all. So this is the transformative power. They have never lived experience. Just one, I think, because her father brought her to the Taksim Square. But the others, they literally, they did not have this experience, but they all mentioned Gezi Movement. So it shows already how it transformed people, young people, the memory of Gezi. Like we want to create that kind of world as well. We want change, and they reproduce sometimes the same tactics, same slogans. So it's also interesting that to see everywhere is Taksim in Paris, 13 years, like 15 years after Gezi movement last month. So these kind of slogans or like the Çapulcu identity is still existing in the banners and in the slogans. I find it transformative already for the young people. And these young people also, they are like the Gen Z. So we thought that it was like they were apolitical. They were not political at all, but apparently they are very political as the climate movement activists. It's the same idea. And how so yeah, I will connect to the second question, maybe about the collective action. There is a social movements scholar, sociologist, political scientist, Doug McAdam, who worked on civil rights movement in the US. And he has several notions, several concepts. One is tactical innovation. Tactical innovation is, he basically looked at how the civil rights movement activists innovated their tactics. Like they did sit-ins, they did other actions, and they changed it all the time because the system adapts to the tactics. Like in the standing man example, the system, let's say the police, couldn't understand what was happening right at that moment, and they couldn't react. And there are videos on YouTube you can still watch, and they're trying to say, they're calling him, their police around him and saying, "Are you crazy? You lost your mind," because they don't understand that kind of tactic, what's happening. It's not even a tactic for him. It was like a, protest. He just wanted to stay still. But and then they adapted. So they started after 8 hours, 10 hours of performance for protest. They started to arrest people because they were standing still. So that kind of, this is a very small example, of course, but the people innovate, make tactical innovation, and the system adapts, and there's something new. And sometimes they reproduce some actions. We still use sit-ins, for example, right? We still use some of the tactics from the civil rights movement in today's protests. So there's a kind of adaptability, reproduction in the activist resistance side, but also the systems, they find the governments or like the people in power, they try to find a way to stop the protest as well. So it's continuous in this way.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe first your question or remark on continuity. I think for me, at least, there's a distinction between what I call in my paper and some of my work, the crisis continuum, which is this permanent emergency, prolonged emergency, and then there's the continuity, and I think that's what you meant in a more hopeful sense. And in that sense of continuity, that's where I mentioned this idea of integrating resilience, the concept of resilience as an interdisciplinary principle, not just something as a legal safeguard, but really as a framework that can span from political science to economy, public health as well, environmental policy, to address these systemic issues, because it cannot simply be addressed from one discipline or one point of view. And this is where the CAS approach is useful. Maybe that also partially answers your question, because it provides this concept of, as I said, non-linearity. So we're viewing institutions and legal frameworks as a sort of living system that must evolve. So there's a continuity, but it's not a linear continuity. And we cannot predict how it will evolve, but we can maintain these essential core functions to have these. That's why I always talk about maintaining the core democratic norms or core democratic foundations. So the essential parts of the system. And now to jump to complete a bit regarding your question, there isn't, I would say, prescriptive solution per se provided by CAS theory. There's no like blueprint for good law or good legal framework, because usually CAS theory is not really used actually by legal experts. It's really something that I've borrowed from the sciences, and after working in many groups with interdisciplinary projects, it just shows, as I said, that these legal systems are not static, they're adaptive, and that it's important to look at the feedback loop. So I think this could be one of the interesting approaches, these feedback loops, which can be either positive or negative, and they can either reinforce the democratic backsliding in this case, or help prevent it. So in this sense, it can be interesting to either prevent it or get out of it. Yeah. And to your question, Max, maybe briefly, I agree with what you said, especially about citizenship. It can be both empowering and also exclusionary, but my point was not to, I would say, idealize the idea of people as a homogeneous whole, but rather to argue that this crisis governance has to include these participatory mechanisms to be transparent. And here I think that intellectuals play a crucial role, whether it's academics, whether it's also advising policymakers in resisting the normalization or not, or in helping the backsliding with emergency powers. I think we have a role in naming what's at stake by uncovering how these legal gray zones work, what their impact is, and to inform the general public, because these measures are not being imposed on us, they're being voted somehow, but they're being voted with an increasing populist justification often, so people are not really informed. So it's our role to inform the general public, I would say, but also those who are more in charge, so policymakers or officials.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
So thank you so much for that question. I think both of that continuity question and also what the momentum of movements. Yeah, I personally think that's like the $1 million question, something that I'm constantly concerned about. And so if we actually look at the New Zealand example, right now they're debating this regulatory bill that would actually give a minister, the same person that introduced that treaty principles bill, the power to override anything that's taking place in New Zealand in regards to like mining rights, land rights, water licenses, and things like that. And so if the Treaty Waitangi was able to actually block it, he would actually have the power to actually completely just deny that and give corporations the power to actually do what they like. And so that's being debated right now. And it's something that's, once again, is rising up a bit, but they don't have that same momentum, that same energy that they previously had. And so it is quite concerning. Also in New Zealand, they don't actually have a constitution and they don't have an upper house. And so it's actually far easier to pass legislation, and the coalition conservative government has a clear majority. And so lots of these bills will get passed. And so it'll be interesting to see how they actually oppose it and challenge it in a number of different ways. And I totally agree with you that it is quite concerning. And how do you actually maintain that continuity? And so when we look at the Australia example, they are trying to engage with the public in a more organized way. So there's lots of different opportunities for people to understand what's going on with the treaty negotiations. And they constantly are asking the Indigenous public and the wider public to join in to learn about what's happening with it. And they have quite a big advertising campaign. And even we have a local elder that comes to our school, and he literally came to our school to chat to us, and he said, I'm here to agitate. And I'm here to engage with the kids and get them to be fired up. You know, I'm here to essentially be kicked out of the school by getting them so fired up. And he really did. Like he tried his best to actually get them, you know, engaged and interested in this treaty making process. And so there is these attempts to sort of engage with the public in a number of different ways. And I guess I would say that the best way in which to do it would be to really engage with that public sphere and build a wide variety of organic intellectuals that can engage with people in a number of different ways. I think it's quite interesting with like social media, how that's actually taking place, and more people are leaving the you know, mainstream forms of media for social media. So we'll see how that comes about. But then in my essay or article that I wrote, because of what happened with the Voice of Parliament and that use of misinformation, one scholar was talking about how truth has become like a marketplace, and where people are like, you know, debating, discussing different sorts of ideas what truth actually is because of all this misinformation out there. And so even though we have these organic intellectuals, we also have these other ones who are essentially spreading misinformation that's really, you know, obscuring the debate. And so I definitely think this is probably one of the most interesting or most important things to actually address, is this idea of continuity and how you actually maintain momentum in these movements, but also how do you have, you know, worthwhile ideas that people are actually going to engage with.
Thanks very much. We started a few minutes late, so maybe we have time for, yes, one or two short questions and answers. Yes, please. Yeah, the microphone.
Continuation of no, does it work? No. Continuation of continuity issue. Do you think there is a learning process, meaning that, you know, the society evolves as more prepared for tricks which politicians do to them? For instance, when they direct them as an enemy image to migrant, they already are aware that this is an attempt to distract their attention from their own failures of their politicians to improve the issue which they're frustrated with, rather than. Is there a learning process? Like, for instance, with AI in the social networks, you already see a lot of people saying, oh, this is not a true picture, photo, or video. This is made by AI. How is it going with the critical thinking, and is there any continuity with the people? Is it now more difficult to get the people distracted from the true essence of the problem? And what do you call the driving force and trigger of the event of 2017? What was, of all the factors, the most important, which made the Victoria Forum or whatever happen in, and why in 2017? Thank you.
Okay. All right. If I don't see any immediate hand, short responses from those who want to respond. These were also big questions.
Okay, so I'll maybe respond in a backwards kind of way. So with the treaty negotiating process, Indigenous people in Victoria and the Victorian government have a long progressive kind of history. And so in Victoria, they have been open to, I guess, how do I say it? They've been open to negotiations with the different sorts of representatives of Indigenous Victorians to actually do something to have a constructive dialogue between the two sorts of groups. And we've had a long sort of state government run of Labor governments or social democratic governments, whatever you want to call it. And so they've been more willing to actually try it out. So I'm not sure if 2017 or 2018 is you know, a particular, you know, important kind of year or not. I just think it's been an ongoing kind of process where they've slowly worked up towards it, and it's something that the government itself, the Victorian government, was really big on, and so they really wanted to actually engage in a meaningful way with the Indigenous population of Victoria, indigenous population of Victoria will say, well, this is what we want to do, and this is how we want to do it. And so the fact that they actually did treaty first and then created assembly is something that was really important, because essentially they wanted to negotiate that out so then it could be on their terms. And then from there, they can actually decide how it's going to go from there. And so having the treaty and the truth telling was really important to them.
Thank you. Any last words?
I can answer maybe. Very short. Is there a learning process? Yes, this is why I'm doing this research. The learning process is the creativity. We learn through creativity and experience. So it's about taking the streets sometimes, seeing something on social media right now, and maybe use that knowledge in some other circumstances. This is the learning process. And as I said, it's a cycle. So there will be hope, there will be hopelessness, despair, and then again, hope as like the resistance and the repression and the resistance and the repression. So I find it pretty normal that we have that kind of cycle, because imagine you're living with very high emotions all the time. It's not possible for the body to handle it. It's the same thing. You need both emotions. You need both in the world, to me.
I can maybe just add something on that, on this idea of cycle. There's an interesting book called Authoritarianism, a very short introduction by, if I'm not mistaken, James Loxton, that talks about this idea of democratic recession, about like these basically cycles. So it's normal to have a cycle, and you can either, once the crisis subsides or once the performance, becomes normalized, whatever, either get out of it or go into a democratic backsliding. So I do think, yeah, it's an adaptive learning process, as you said. Yeah.
So I think that thanks to our presenters, we have maybe fulfilled at least partially the task to bring some hope and optimism. So creativity and innovation needed to make decisions to overcome that crisis phase. It's not yet the tragedy, the last phase of the Greek drama. So thank you very much to all three of you and to all our audience members for all the questions. Have a nice evening.